Their encryption had been undone. Our snare was ready. On the morning of June 4, 1942, I stood on the flight deck of the USS Enterprise, the Pacific wind cutting across the steel surface as our Dauntless dive bombers growled to life. The engine's thunder rolled across the deck, fierce and rhythmic like a heartbeat before battle. Ahead of us stretched the vast Pacific, shimmering under the newborn sun. It looked calm, almost serene, yet within hours it would become the watery grave of Japan's most powerful carrier fleet. Far beyond the horizon, some 200 miles northwest of Midway Atoll, Admiral Chuichi Nagumo's task force advanced confidently. His 4 carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, the same that had torn through Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier, were now steaming toward what they thought would be another effortless triumph. Their decks brimmed with armed aircraft, their crews unaware that the element of surprise no longer belonged to them. For weeks, we had been intercepting their communications. The Japanese naval code, JN-25, had been broken, and we knew precisely where Nagumo's fleet would appear. What awaited them that morning was not conquest, but catastrophe. My name is Norman Jack Dusty Cly, Lieutenant Junior Grade, pilot of an SBD Dauntless in Scouting Squadron 6 aboard the Enterprise. I was born in Coffeyville, Kansas in 1916, graduated from the U.S. Naval Academy in 1938, and earned my wings in April 1941. By the summer of '42, I'd seen enough combat to believe I understood naval warfare, but nothing could prepare me for what Midway would reveal, the total annihilation of Japan's carrier strength in a matter of minutes, an event that would turn the tide of the Pacific War forever. At 0400 hours, the ready room aboard Enterprise was dense with cigarette smoke and tension. Lieutenant Commander Clarence Wade McClusky, Jr., our air group commander, a seasoned 1926 Academy graduate, stood before us with a chart illuminated under a single lamp. "Gentlemen," he said evenly, tapping the map, "the Japanese carrier force is here, 200 miles northwest of Midway." His voice was calm but electric. 4 carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, 2 battleships, 2 heavy cruisers, 11 destroyers. Each name struck like a drumbeat. This wasn't just an enemy fleet, it was the Kido Butai, the mightiest strike force afloat. Together, those 4 carriers carried nearly 250 aircraft and the most lethal pilots in the world. Then, McClusky gave credit where it was due: Commander Joseph Rochefort and his cryptologic team at Station Hypo. They had cracked JN-25, deciphering every major movement in Admiral Yamamoto's plan. The Japanese intended to attack Midway at dawn, lure our carriers out, and crush them in ambush. But fate, guided by intelligence and timing, had flipped the board. As McClusky spoke, I realized we weren't merely going to fight a battle. We were about to change history itself.
"Fate leads the willing and drags the unwilling," Seneca once wrote. That morning, every man on Enterprise chose to be led. They expected the Japanese strike on Midway to begin at 0430, McClusky reported. At that hour, most of the enemy fighter cover would be committed, he explained, and their carriers would be in the process of recovering and rearming, the moment their decks were at greatest risk. That interval, he said plainly, would be the opening we must exploit. Lieutenant Earl Gallagher, who led Scouting 6, recorded each point with careful precision. Gallagher, a veteran of Pearl Harbor, kept meticulous logs. Beside him, Lieutenant Richard Best of Bombing 6 monitored the meteorological reports. The forecast read, light southeast wind at about 5 knots and broken clouds around 1,500 feet. Conditions ideal for dive attacks. Around me, the men, a mix of seasoned flyers and fresh-faced aviators awaiting their baptism by fire, all registered the same sober calculation of what lay ahead. There were hard realities to accept. The Mitsubishi A6M0 outclassed much of our airframe in agility. The Japanese pilots were, on balance, more experienced. Our planned strike would push aircraft to the edge of their range, a round trip of roughly 175 miles with only minimal reserves for contingencies. McClusky outlined the sequence. The Hornet's torpedo squadron would launch first to draw enemy fighters low, followed by the dive bombers, our intended killing blow. The order was clear: airborne by 7 o'clock. By dawn, the Enterprise's flight deck had become an orchestrated frenzy. Sailors in color-coded jerseys moved with practiced purpose. Red shirts handled ordnance, purple shirts tended fuel, brown shirts checked engines and control surfaces. Each group performed a narrowly defined role in a choreography that could not tolerate error. I made my way to my assigned SBD, Bureau number 639, while deck crew strapped the last restraints and double-checked fastenings. My rear gunner, John Snowden, a quiet Illinois native who had once picked out approaching Zeros and likely saved my life, was already inspecting the twin .30 caliber guns mounted behind the cockpit. I ran through my personal checklist aloud as I climbed into the cockpit. Control surfaces free, bomb rack secure, fuel quantities verified. Our tanks held 230 gallons in the main cell and two 58-gallon wing tanks, giving a rough endurance of 4.5 hours if fuel consumption was managed carefully. The Douglas SBD Dauntless was hardly a speed demon. Its top speed hovered near 255 miles an hour, but its virtues were stability in a steep dive and structural toughness. It could return from damage that would have shredded lighter machines. I fastened harnesses and scanned the familiar panel of instruments: altimeter, airspeed indicator, fuel gauges, engine temperature, and oil pressure. Small, reliable instruments that would be the interface between life and death. At 0:45, the ship speakers called for pilots to start engines. I turned the key, and the right-hand R-1820 Cyclone coughed and then steadied into a rolling thunder. Launches began in deliberate waves. First, the Combat Air Patrol, 20 Grumman F-4F Wildcats to establish a defensive umbrella. Then the Torpedo Group, 14 obsolete TBD Devastators under Lieutenant Commander Eugene Lindsay, lumbered down the deck, heavy with Mark 13 torpedoes, their low clearance making their takeoffs look perilous. They seemed exposed and slow as they slipped over the carrier's edge. Last in our sequence came the dive bombers, Scouting 6 under Gallagher with 18 SBDs, and Bombing 6 under Best fielding 15. Our formations ready, engines warm, poised to fly into what every one of us knew could be the defining encounter of the Pacific War. I was assigned as number 2 in the 3rd Division, flying in close formation behind the lead group under Commander McClusky. The takeoff sequence from the Enterprise was always a tense ritual. One mistake, one hesitation, and the ocean waited below. The carrier turned sharply into the wind, building speed to over 30 knots. The officer of the deck, standing firm against the gale, spun his checkered flag in a wide arc, signaling full power. When the flag dropped, I released the brakes and felt the Dauntless lurch forward with a growl. The ship's island structure flashed past in my peripheral vision. The deck edge rushed closer. At 65 knots, I pulled back gently. The wheels left the deck, and for an instant, the bomber seemed to hang motionless between sky and sea before the wings caught lift. We were airborne.
"Nice takeoff, Mr. Kleiss," came Snowden's calm voice from the rear seat. "Thanks," I replied, adjusting trim. "Stay sharp back there." It took the better part of an hour for the strike group to assemble. By 0806, 33 SBD Dauntless bombers from the Enterprise had climbed through thin clouds to 19,000 feet. The planned rendezvous with the Hornets group never materialized, and McClusky, calculating fuel burn by instinct, made the call to proceed alone rather than circle in vain.
We flew northwest in complete radio silence, every pilot aware that chatter could give us away. My eyes moved constantly from the altimeter to the fuel gauge, then to the bomb site. From this altitude, once I rolled into a dive, I would have only seconds to align and release, a single chance with no correction possible. At 0920, we reached the coordinates where the enemy should have been. Nothing but endless Pacific, a deep, polished mirror stretching to the horizon. I checked fuel again. More than half was gone. Simple math told me we had maybe half an hour before we'd have to turn back or risk ditching far from any rescue. You could feel the unease even through the radio silence, every man doing the same grim arithmetic. Then, at 0955, McClusky rocked his wings sharply. Below, a faint white streak cut across the blue, a lone Japanese destroyer racing northeast. McClusky turned after it without hesitation, wagering it was heading toward the main force. For 20 long minutes we followed that trail, fuel needles edging toward empty. Then at precisely 10:20, the ocean below erupted with shapes. There they were, the Japanese fleet. 4 carriers, grouped by pairs and encircled by cruisers and destroyers, their wakes carving bright lines through the deep blue. From our altitude, they looked almost miniature, models arranged with military precision. On their decks, aircraft stood in neat rows, armed, fueled, preparing for another strike. Not a single Zero patrolled at our level. They were all down low, mopping up the remnants of our torpedo squadrons. McClusky's voice crackled in my headset, clipped and clear. Scouting 6, take the carrier on the left. Bombing 6, the one on the right. But confusion spread fast. Both squadrons began their dives on the same target, Kaga. I shoved the stick forward and tipped into my own dive. The Dauntless howled as it fell, the wind clawing at the fuselage, my body crushed against the seat by the violent acceleration. The altimeter needles spun backward, 18,000, 15, 12. Through the bomb site, the Kaga swelled rapidly, its deck alive with motion, crewmen running, anti-aircraft guns swiveling skyward, white puffs of flak bursting around us. Still, I held steady. At 10,000 feet, I saw it clearly. Aircraft lined up for launch, fuel hoses draped across the deck, bombs waiting on carts, an explosive chain just waiting for a spark. Gallagher released first. His bomb struck near the island structure, detonating in a sheet of flame that hurled men and metal into the air. At 2,500 feet, I pressed my own release and pulled hard on the stick. The G-forces slammed me back, black narrowing my vision to a tunnel. The Dauntless shuddered, wings bending but holding. We leveled out just above the sea surface, racing away at full throttle. "Direct hit," Snowden yelled over the intercom. "Forward elevator's gone." I risked a glance back. Kaga was burning from bow to stern, black smoke twisting into the sky like a signal that the tide of war had just begun to turn. As I banked hard to the left, the sight below confirmed the hit. My bomb had landed squarely amidships, and within seconds the forward deck of Kaga was consumed by fire. Lieutenant Gallagher's strike had smashed into the aft section, followed in quick succession by others from our formation. In less than half a minute, 4 direct impacts turned the once proud carrier into a roaring inferno stretching from bow to stern. The flames leapt skyward, punctuated by secondary explosions as fuel and munitions ignited in violent succession. Meanwhile, Commander Dick Best, realizing that both squadrons had mistakenly converged on the same target, broke off early with 2 of his wingmen. Banking toward the north, he spotted Akagi, the Japanese flagship, maneuvering just beyond the formation. Best's Dauntless dove steeply through flak and smoke, releasing a single 1,000-pound bomb that struck near the center of Akagi's flight deck. The weapon punched through to the hangar below, detonating among fully armed aircraft being refueled for the next strike. A split second later, a chain reaction tore through the ship. Akagi was transformed into a floating furnace, her decks engulfed, and her command bridge enveloped in black smoke. At nearly the same time, 10:22 a.m., dive bombers from the Yorktown arrived overhead and descended on Soryu. In less than half a minute, 3,000-pound bombs struck home. The carrier erupted in a towering column of flame that rose hundreds of feet into the air. Within moments, 3 Japanese carriers, Kaga, Akagi, and Soryu, had been rendered helpless, burning and broken across the Pacific. The suddenness of it was staggering. Pulling away, I looked back at a scene of utter devastation. Kaga resembled a volcano torn open at sea, with explosions cascading through her hull. The forward elevator, a slab of steel weighing several tons, was blasted high into the air before plunging into the ocean a quarter-mile away. Akagi burned from stem to stern, her deck curling under intense heat. Tiny figures, crewmen, leapt from the sides into water slicked with burning oil. Soryu was listing badly, fires spreading across her hangars as detonations ripped her hull apart. Within 20 minutes, she rolled over completely, her underside flashing silver in the sun before sliding beneath the waves, taking more than 700 men down with her. From combat ready to a grave at the bottom of the sea, less time than it took to drink a cup of coffee. But one carrier had escaped destruction. Hiryu, positioned roughly 10 miles to the north and hidden by a drifting rain squall. While her sister ships burned, Hiryu was already launching a counterstrike aimed directly at our own carriers. Then came the warning, zeros high at 3 o'clock. Snowden's twin machine guns rattled to life as 2 enemy fighters dove toward us. I pushed the nose down, using the Dauntless's superior diving speed to evade their tracers, which stitched bright arcs through the air around us. "Snowden, you good?" I shouted into the intercom. "Hit but still with you," he replied through static. "Got one." I caught a glimpse of a Zero spiraling down in smoke before it vanished into the ocean below. But more were closing fast. I dropped lower, weaving erratically to throw off their aim, the fuel gauge now quivering on empty. The return flight was a slow descent into exhaustion and anxiety. The needle sat on 0, but experience told me there was still a thin reserve, just a few unusable gallons that might be coaxed into the lines by careful throttle work. I leaned the mixture until the engine coughed, then held it there, trading engine smoothness for endurance. All around us, other Dauntlesses limped home, some trailing smoke, others radioing their final messages. "Engine out, ditching now. Marking position, over. Emergency fuel, request recovery priority." Ahead, 2 bombers descended steadily toward the surface. One managed a near-perfect ditching. I saw the crew climb onto the wing, waving before the plane slipped under. My own engine sputtered, coughing through its last few drops of fuel. Then, through the haze and sun glare, I saw her, Enterprise, turning into the wind, deck crew ready for recovery.
Enterprise, this is 6-2. Fuel, critical. Request immediate landing. As the carrier loomed larger, I felt the vibration of the dying engine through the stick. One way or another, the mission was over. I was assigned as the 3rd plane in the landing sequence, watching the 2 ahead of me touch down one after another, each consuming precious seconds that felt like hours. My engine was faltering badly, every sputter threatening to silence it for good. As I entered the landing pattern, the inevitable happened. The engine quit entirely. I was now gliding, no power, relying on altitude and luck. There would be no second attempt. I lowered the landing gear manually, dropped the flaps, and aligned myself with the carrier's deck. The landing signal officer waved his paddles, his gestures sharp and urgent. "Cut power," he signaled, unaware that I already had none left to give. I was coming in too high. I pushed the nose down, trading altitude for the last bit of airspeed I could muster. The propeller spun uselessly in the wind. The deck rose up rapidly beneath me. Too fast, too close. Then impact. The Dauntless bounced hard, skidding across the deck before the tailhook smagged the number 3 wire, yanking the aircraft to a brutal stop. Before the propeller even stopped turning, the deck crew rushed in. "Get him out," someone yelled. My rear gunner, John Snowden, was pulled from the back seat, bloodied, hit in both shoulder and leg, but alive. The medics rushed him below. My SBD looked like it shouldn't have been able to fly at all. Over 40 bullet holes riddled her fuselage, a testament to the Dauntless's toughness and the luck that still lingered with us. The ready room was heavy with silence when I returned. Victory or not, the cost had been staggering. Of the 14 torpedo bombers from Torpedo Squadron 6, only 4 had come back. 10 crews, friends, were gone. News from the Hornet was even worse. Torpedo 8 had been completely annihilated. 15 aircraft down, 29 men lost. Only Ensign George Gay survived, floating alone amid the wreckage as he watched our dive bombers descend on the Japanese fleet. Commander John Waldron had led his men straight into the teeth of the enemy without hesitation. His last message crackled through the radio. "We're going in. We won't turn back. Good luck." Not a single torpedo struck its target, but their sacrifice was not in vain. Their suicidal attack drew the Japanese combat air patrol low, clearing the skies for us. It was that opening that allowed McClusky's dive bombers to strike unopposed from above. When McClusky returned, his shoulder was bandaged where shrapnel had torn through his flight jacket. He said, "We got 3. Kaga, Akagi, Soryu. Gone. But Hiryu is still operational. She's the one that hit Yorktown." Intelligence officers brought updates that afternoon. The Yorktown had taken 3 bomb hits around noon, then 2 torpedoes at 14:30. Listing heavily, she was eventually abandoned, yet her endurance had bought critical hours, time enough to locate Hiryu before she could strike again. By then, Japanese losses were staggering, around 2,500 men. Each carrier carried roughly 1,200 to 1,500 personnel, pilots, deck crew, mechanics, engineers, and only a fraction escaped. Each number on that list represented a human life, someone's son or husband claimed by flames and the cold Pacific in service of an empire's ambition.
As the sun dipped low, we launched once more. 24 dive bombers roared off Enterprise's deck in pursuit of Hiryu. At 1700 hours, they found her. 4 bombs found their mark. The Japanese carrier burned uncontrollably through the night before being scuttled by her own crew. By dawn, the once formidable Kido Butai, the same strike force that had humbled Pearl Harbor, no longer existed. In the following days, we pressed the advantage, pursuing the retreating Japanese fleet and sinking the heavy cruiser Mikuma. Only then did the full weight of what had happened begin to sink in. Japan had lost 4 of its 6 fleet carriers, vessels that had taken years to construct and could not be replaced quickly. Worse still was the loss of over 3,000 trained sailors and aviators, including more than 100 veteran carrier pilots. These men were not merely skilled flyers, they were the living foundation of Japan's carrier warfare doctrine, their experience irreplaceable. When they went down, an entire generation of operational knowledge vanished with them. From that day forward, Japan's naval air arm would never recover its former strength. Though new carriers would be built, the crews that might have made them effective were gone forever. For the United States, the Battle of Midway became proof that intelligence and resolve could offset numerical inferiority. Commander Rochefort's cryptanalysts at Station Hypo had cracked the Japanese code, giving us insight into their plans and allowing our forces to position perfectly for the ambush. Without that knowledge, we would have arrived too late and fought on their terms. The battle also exposed critical flaws in Admiral Yamamoto's grand strategy. His operation was too elaborate. Forces spread over vast distances, bound by rigid radio silence that prevented coordination once the plan began to fail. He had underestimated both the reach of American intelligence and the determination of its pilots. June 4, 1942, marked more than just a naval victory. It was the turning point of the Pacific War. On that day, amid smoke, fire, and the endless ocean, the balance of power shifted irrevocably. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo found himself caught in a moment that would decide the fate of an empire. At 07:28 hours, reports arrived that American ships had been sighted to the northeast.
His flight decks, however, were cluttered with aircraft being refueled and rearmed for a second strike on Midway. The dilemma was cruelly simple yet paralyzing. Should he launch immediately with the wrong armaments, or take time to prepare the planes properly? That half hour of hesitation, 30 minutes of uncertainty amid the noise of engines and the smoke of fuel, sealed the fate of his fleet. By the time his carrier crews scrambled to relaunch, our dive bombers were already descending out of the sun. That evening, aboard the USS Enterprise, the ocean was calm again, the war momentarily distant. I stood on the flight deck, the cool Pacific wind brushing my face, and looked up at the same stars that had shone over Pearl Harbor 6 months before. They had watched the beginning of Japan's triumph and now bore witness to its undoing. The adrenaline that had carried us through the battle had burned away, leaving only fatigue and a quiet, aching emptiness that victory could not fill.
My thoughts drifted to the torpedo squadrons, the men who had flown straight into annihilation. Lieutenant Commander John Waldron and his men had known what awaited them. Their TBD devastators were slow, outdated relics, outclassed by the agile Japanese Zeros. Still, they held formation, pressing their attack as they were cut to pieces. Waldron's final transmission, calm, defiant, had promised that his squadron would not turn back. Ensign George Gay, the lone survivor of Torpedo 8, watched the sea erupt in flame as his comrades fell, one by one. For 30 harrowing hours he floated alone, half submerged in fuel-streaked water, hiding beneath a seat cushion as Japanese ships passed overhead. He would carry that memory and its survivor's guilt for the rest of his life. But as I looked back on the chaos we had unleashed, I couldn't ignore the men on the other side of that inferno. During our dives, I had seen them clearly. Tiny figures racing across carrier decks, manning anti-aircraft guns, dragging wounded crewmates, shoving burning aircraft into the sea. They were not nameless enemies. They were young men like us, many who had been flying since the war in China, fathers and sons whose hopes ended in smoke and seawater. When Kaga and Akagi went up in flames, the ocean was strewn with bodies. A few destroyers rescued survivors, but most perished, consumed by burning oil, torn apart by explosions, or lost beneath the waves. War, I realized, is never clean, nor heroic in the way stories pretend. It's a machine that devours the young and leaves behind only wreckage and memory. Historians later called Midway the turning point of the Pacific War, and they were right. In a single morning, the balance of naval power shifted irreversibly. Japan's dominance at sea was broken. What had been carrier superiority turned first to parity and soon to inferiority as American industry began to flood the Pacific with ships, planes, and trained crews. The deeper truth, however, was not just strategic. It was human and systemic. Japan's loss of seasoned pilots at Midway, followed by the attrition of Guadalcanal, crippled its naval air arm. These aviators had taken years to train. Their skills and intuition could not simply be replaced. Japan's pilot training programs produced barely 100 carrier-qualified flyers each year. By contrast, American flight schools would soon graduate thousands annually. As Admiral Chester Nimitz later reflected, Midway was won not only in the air, but also through intelligence, logistics, and sheer determination. The cryptanalysts who cracked Japan's codes, the shipyard crews who repaired the Yorktown in 72 hours instead of the expected 3 months, and the pilots who attacked despite impossible odds, all were threads of the same victory. Even as the battle raged, a new generation of American carriers, the Essex class, was already under construction.
These massive ships would soon dominate the Pacific, each larger and more capable than any vessel the Japanese could produce. In total, 24 of them would join the fleet. Japan, by contrast, would struggle to complete even a half-dozen new carriers, most converted from existing hulls, none equal in capability. Japan began the war with 6 frontline carriers and the finest naval aviators in the world. After Midway, only 2 remained operational, their core air crews gone. New ships would sail, yes, but without the skilled pilots who had once made Japan's navy so formidable. They were mere shells of potential. The carefully forged strike force that had terrorized the Pacific for 6 months effectively ceased to exist that June morning.
I was one of the fortunate ones. I survived the war after flying 85 combat missions, including the attack runs that struck Kaga, Hiryu, and the cruiser Mikuma. For those actions, I received the Navy Cross. I remained in service through the Korean conflict and retired as a captain in 1962. I lived long enough to see a century of life pass and to watch the world move far beyond the age of the carrier battles. When I died in 2016, I was among the last of the Midway dive bomber pilots still alive. As for Wade McClusky, the man whose intuition led us to the Japanese fleet, he survived as well, eventually retiring as a rear admiral in 1956. He never sought recognition for the choice that altered the course of history. Following a single Japanese destroyer's wake across the Pacific, a decision that led an entire fleet to victory. Phil, his son, once described him as a man of few words, reserved, private, and content to let others speak for him. When he passed away in 1976, much of his contribution had already slipped quietly into obscurity. Others, however, carried the memory forward. George Gay, the lone survivor of Torpedo Squadron 8, became a commercial pilot after the war and later devoted his life to telling the story of his fallen comrades. Through lectures, interviews, and his memoir, Sole Survivor, he honored the men who had died before his eyes. In 1994, his ashes were scattered in the same stretch of the Pacific where his squadron had perished 52 years earlier, a symbolic reunion with those who never returned. Lieutenant Commander Dick Best, whose precision bombing destroyed the Akagi with a single hit, paid a different price. During the Midway operation, a malfunctioning oxygen system exposed him to caustic fumes that scarred his lungs permanently. Forced into early retirement, he never flew again, though he lived until 2001. Many credited him as the man who won Midway, though he himself dismissed such praise. The Japanese carriers he helped sink now lie nearly 17,000 feet below the Pacific, silent relics of a vanished empire. In 2019, explorers located the wreck of the Kaga, remarkably upright on the seafloor, though its flight deck had been obliterated by fire. Nearby lay the remains of the Akagi, its twisted metal scarred by explosions. These ships had become underwater tombs for thousands of sailors, war graves resting in eternal stillness. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, who commanded the Japanese carrier task force, survived the battle but never truly recovered from its consequences. Stripped of prestige, he was assigned to minor shore duties and eventually placed in charge of defending Saipan. When American forces invaded in July 1944, Nagumo took his own life rather than face capture. His chief of staff, Admiral Kusaka, lived through the war and later wrote detailed accounts of the campaign. He defended Nagumo's choices while acknowledging the unbearable pressures under which those decisions were made. Captain Mitsuo Fuchida, who had once led the attack on Pearl Harbor and was aboard the Akagi at Midway, barely survived the inferno that consumed the carrier, suffering broken ankles as he escaped. After the war, he underwent a profound transformation, converting to Christianity and dedicating his life to promoting reconciliation between Japan and the United States. Historians often summarize Midway with a single striking phrase: Japan lost the war in 5 minutes. Admiral Irasoku Yamamoto, the architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, seemed to grasp this grim truth even in victory's aftermath. In April 1943, his plane was intercepted and shot down over Bougainville by American P-38 fighters who had used decoded communications to track his route. Long before his death, Yamamoto had reportedly confided to his aides, "I have killed many young men today," recognizing that Midway had doomed Japan's war effort.
In 2000, the Midway Atoll was designated a national memorial. The same airstrip where Marines had once faced relentless bombardment is now a protected wildlife refuge where albatrosses nest peacefully on ground once cratered by bombs. Norman Kleiss, one of the battle's dive bomber pilots, later reflected that they were not heroes in the way history often paints them, just young men doing the work that needed to be done. The real heroes, he said, were the torpedo crews who flew knowing they would not return, the cryptographers who cracked enemy codes in secrecy, the mechanics who kept crippled aircraft flying, the repair teams who saved burning ships, and the medics who fought to keep shattered bodies alive. Midway demonstrated that wars are not won solely through superior machines or elite skill, but through adaptability, endurance, and courage under crushing pressure. The Japanese possessed the better planes and pilots, but the Americans had intelligence breakthroughs, radar coordination, resilient shipyards, and a capacity to replace losses tenfold. Most of all, they had leaders willing to take calculated risks when hesitation could mean disaster. Admiral Nimitz wagered the entire carrier force on intelligence that might have been wrong. Commander McClusky pressed on despite dwindling fuel, following instinct that led him to the enemy fleet. Dick Best attacked an unexpected target with only 2 wingmen at his side, and Waldron led his men to certain death because he believed it was necessary. The battle itself spanned barely 2 days, yet its effects rippled across the rest of the Pacific War. Before Midway, Japan had advanced without challenge, sweeping across Asia and the Pacific like an unstoppable tide. Afterward, that momentum was broken. Japan would never again win a major offensive victory. The war would grind on for 3 more brutal years, claiming hundreds of thousands of additional lives, but its outcome had already been determined in those few decisive minutes on June 4th, when American dive bombers found their mark and the Japanese carriers, loaded with fueled and armed aircraft, became floating infernos. History often turns on fragile hinges, moments so small that the world might have swung a different way with the faintest shift in circumstance. Imagine, for instance, if Commander McClusky had turned for home after failing to find the Japanese fleet at the expected intercept point. If Admiral Nagumo had chosen to launch his strike half an hour earlier. If the obsolete American torpedoes had actually functioned and Torpedo Squadron 8's attack had found its mark. Each "if" represents a thread that could have unraveled history. Yet what truly mattered was what did occur on that clear morning in June 1942. Against staggering odds, a handful of weary American pilots, flying aircraft inferior in both speed and firepower, struck the most powerful naval force on Earth at its moment of greatest exposure and annihilated it. The outcome was shaped by a convergence of intelligence breakthroughs, unflinching bravery, costly sacrifice, and the unpredictable hand of chance. It was an impossible victory, one that transformed not only the Pacific War, but the future of the free world. It is difficult today to imagine a time when the very survival of democracy felt uncertain, when the idea of freedom itself teetered in the balance. Yet in June 1942, it did. The fate of the modern world rested on fewer than 400 airmen, drawn from 3 American carriers floating in the heart of the Pacific Ocean. Somehow, impossibly, they were enough. That is the essence of Midway's legacy.
that ordinary people, when faced with extraordinary circumstances, can achieve what reason would call impossible. Democracy, so often dismissed as fragile or indecisive, proved at Midway that it could summon warriors as fearless as any totalitarian state. Free men fighting for their homes and families demonstrated that conviction, not coercion, is the ultimate strength of a nation.
The battle statistics are precise. 4 Japanese carriers sunk, 1 American carrier lost, 3,057 Japanese and 362 Americans killed. Yet numbers obscure the truth that each digit marks a life. A son, a brother, a husband whose dreams and futures vanished in flame and salt water. The ocean that swallowed them remains indifferent, its surface calm and empty where once the fate of empires collided. But we remember because we must. Midway must be remembered, not merely as a military triumph, but as a testament to the resilience of free people when freedom itself stands threatened. In the span of a few devastating minutes, 4 proud vessels of the Imperial Japanese Navy were reduced to infernos, and the tide of war reversed. Those minutes reshaped the century. The pilots who dove through clouds of shrapnel, ignoring certain death to strike their targets, did more than win a battle. They safeguarded the future. Their courage teaches that heroism is not the absence of fear, but the act of pressing forward despite it. History's great turning points are rarely shaped by nations or governments, but by individuals who refuse to yield when everything seems lost. Midway endures as proof that the resolve of a few can alter the course of the world. The dead of Midway, American and Japanese alike, deserve remembrance not as enemies, but as men who fought and died for duty as they understood it. The American airmen who perished defending freedom and the Japanese sailors who died saving their burning ships shared a common humanity. Their courage deserves respect beyond the divisions of war. Their sacrifices were not meaningless. Out of their destruction emerged peace. The Pacific, once a vast battleground, is now a sea of commerce, exploration, and friendship. The 2 nations that once fought to the death now stand as allies, bound by mutual respect and shared values. The war that once seemed endless is now memory, 8 decades distant. Soon, no living soul will remain to say, "I was there. I saw Kaga erupt. I watched Akagi burn. I dove through flak and found my mark." But the story must continue to be told because freedom's preservation demands remembrance. Freedom, as Midway reminds us, is never free. It is earned, again and again, by those willing to climb into obsolete aircraft, to face overwhelming odds, and to give their lives so that tyranny might fail. In those radiant, terrible minutes of June 4, 1942, as the world hung in the balance, they tipped the scales toward liberty. Their courage saved more than a battle. It saved the idea of freedom itself.